Good afternoon, everyone. It is August 30th, and I want to talk about the war in Ukraine. I'm zoomed kind of way out because of what Ukraine has been able to do with drone strikes recently, and I want to show you kind of this is the border of Ukraine here. I know it's a lot of words and stuff. So here's the border of Ukraine, and then Russia runs up like this. So what we're seeing recently is drone strikes taking place near Pskov, which is right here, near the Latvian border right here, as well as drone strikes in and around areas between the border and Moscow. Specifically, Bryansk is one of them, up towards Moscow near Tula, and then another one just north of, or really northeast of Kursk. So these were 5 drone strikes that took place in the last 24 hours, and all of them hit targets. In fact, 6 Russian cargo planes and 1 Russian bomber were destroyed, as well as ammunition depots and other means for Russia to execute or prosecute the war. What is more concerning for Russians is the fact that these are now becoming more frequent. They're also becoming more bold in their ability to reach into distance deep into Russian territory. Now, some of the theories behind the ones up near Pskov was that it was actually launched from Estonia. That's not true. The drones were actually launched coming in this direction here, meaning they were probably partisans within Russia that are unhappy with the Ukraine war, or just Ukraine themselves operating within Russia. This has been an ongoing problem for Russia, trying to fight the internal fight against Ukrainian saboteurs, Ukrainian drone operators, and also people that are just unhappy with Putin that are Russian as well. The attacks in this region right here came from Ukrainian territory specifically. But again, the air defenses up in Pskov were pretty ineffective. They did fire, but they were ineffective, didn't hit anything. And again, cargo aircraft and bombers were struck in this region. Now, turning back to the front lines, we'll go ahead and zoom down into where the main fighting is taking place. And obviously, this is a place where we've discussed before the Robotine, Verbova, Nova Prokopivka lines here. Really a triangle that is right in this region where a lot of the fighting. And if I zoom out a little bit, you can kind of see the aim here. It's Tokmak, to try to find a way to take Tokmak, which is down here. This is a major logistics hub, obviously highly defended. I mean, it's encircled with trenches, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's manned with lots of fighters. We've seen that the defense in depth from Russia involves fighting, fall back to the next position, fighting, fall back, and it's becoming more untenable for Russia as they lose men and equipment at each stage of the fallback for them to continue to defend. Now, the U.S. and Western militaries have pushed for Ukraine to stop kind of spreading and probing in various regions, and we saw this up in Bakhmut, and to focus on one specific area to try and drive through and create a breakthrough point for the Ukrainians to push the entirety of their reserves into the battlefield and possibly take Tokmak or sever many logistics lines to the front line, and therefore a good chunk of the front line could collapse in favor of the Ukrainians. So what the Ukrainians have done recently, as you can see as we zoom in on Robotine, is they have taken the entire town of Robotine. There's still a bit of gray zone that runs to the south of it, but the town proper itself is in Ukrainian hands. Ukraine has then swung downward to try and split into this line right here. So you can see right here, there's a trench system. This is the Russian second line of defense on the ground here for them to defend any routes further south towards Tokmak, Melitopol, etc. But what the Ukrainians are trying to do is drive a wedge through this trench system so that then they can just begin to clear it laterally, which would open up the ability to essentially take Nova Prokopivka as well as Verbova here. And that is what Ukraine has been focusing on. Now, obviously on the battlefield, the enemy gets a vote. As Ukraine has pushed hard downward into this region, the Russians have actually attempted to flank and retake Robotine up here, which is why this right here remains some gray zone area. The Russians have been unsuccessful, mainly because they're not committing fully, essentially. They're just trying to see if they can pull the Ukrainian efforts back in to redefend and thus give Russia time to shore up the trench system here. Ukraine isn't really falling for it. They have consistently pushed hard southward, and many of the Ukrainian fighters have said that the target for the units here isn't necessarily to take Prokopivka or Verbova. It's to go down and take Ocheratu-Vate, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's right here. And let me zoom out and move around here. So the goal of the fighters, the Ukrainian fighters that are pushing, is to come down here and take this town here, rather than to essentially move through and take town after town, town after town. They want to drive a wedge here and therefore cause these trenching systems to collapse entirely, because they've been flanked, is what essentially the Ukrainians are trying to do. This is very difficult to do, though. It's a smart move because it's unexpected, it's bold, and it does directly address the Russian defenses, which are robust. But as we've seen up here, when they pass through the first lines of defense, they're not infallible. These are not perfect defenses. And so when they push down in here, they have to have robust flank guards, because every kilometer, every meter that Ukraine moves in this direction, and I'm going to reset this. Every meter that Ukraine, I'm going to change it to blue too. Every meter that Ukraine moves this direction, creating a wedge, gives Russia opportunities for flanking operations against them. Ukraine knows this, and they have been doing very well in using the Western provided intelligence, aerial intelligence, to see if Russia is moving. And incidentally, a lot of the Western provided intelligence gave nice targetry for these Ukrainian drones that I just spoke about a little earlier. But this is the main thrust right now for Ukraine, and they are taking territory. They are taking very slowly, deliberately, trying to minimize casualties, minimize equipment losses, the ability to take these trench lines. Between these trench lines, though, is absolute hell. They have minefields. They have dragon's teeth. There are tank ditches. A lot of this is not easy going, and they have to use combined arms with engineers, with logistics, with air capability, their fires ability, with which is artillery, whether it's rocket or standard field artillery, providing cover in this region. So while we won't see massive swaths of territory taken, this is a slow and deliberate pace that is seemingly working for Ukraine at this point. Now let's move up north towards where Russia has attempted to not necessarily break through. As I've said this before, Russia is not seeking to take Kupiansk. So Kupiansk is right here. There's been this concern that Russia is going to drive downward and then drive up this road here to take Kupiansk. I still don't think, and many of the military bloggers that are out there and experts discussing this agree, that Russia doesn't have the capability, nor do they want to actually take Kupiansk. There's a river here. Now, what Russia could potentially do in this situation is they could fight all the way up to the river and then spread out and create a blocking effort that prevents Ukraine from counterattacking. Kind of similar to how we have seen Robotine work. Russia could essentially take the river, use the river as defensive positions, and then set up defensive lines, concentric defensive lines, making it once again difficult for Ukraine to retake any territory. Now, that being said, the gray zone is actually here. So Ukraine still owns this territory. Russia is trying to take this territory. According to Ukraine's intelligence, Russia has pushed essentially something like 100,000 reserve troops, but the problem is most of these are very poorly trained and poorly equipped troops that have been called up either from prison systems or from rural areas, and they're just not as effective. Furthermore, their equipment is so bad that they're having to do out in the open area assaults using dismounted troops, which is just not very effective, especially with Ukraine having cluster munitions in this area.